Hello, everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep, letting these stories carry you into the night. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. It helps more than you know. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. This is a story that begins with paradise, with crystal blue waters and endless horizons, with a family vacation that promised memories of laughter and joy. But somewhere between the Caribbean sunset and the dawn of a new day, that paradise transformed into something else entirely. This is the story of Amy Lynn Bradley, a young woman who vanished from a cruise ship in 1998, leaving behind a mystery that has haunted her family and baffled investigators for more than 2 decades. It's a case that asks us to consider what happens when someone disappears in the middle of the ocean, when the last place they were seen was supposed to be safe, when every possible answer seems impossible, and when hope refuses to die even as the years stretch into eternity. The Bradley family had been looking forward to this trip for months. Spring of 1998 brought with it the promise of warmth and adventure, and Ron and Iva Bradley had decided to treat their adult children to something special. A 7-day cruise aboard the Rhapsody of the Seas, one of Royal Caribbean's finest vessels, would take them through the southern Caribbean, stopping at some of the most beautiful ports in the world. It was meant to be a celebration, a chance for the family to spend quality time together before life's obligations pulled them in different directions once more. Ron Bradley, a strong and dependable man who had worked hard his entire life, wanted to give his family this experience. Iva, his devoted wife, had carefully planned every detail, making sure they would have the perfect vacation. Their son Brad, a responsible young man in his early 20s, was excited to explore new places. And then there was Amy. Amy Lynn Bradley was 23 years old in March of 1998, standing on the cusp of everything her life could become. She had recently graduated from Longwood University in Virginia with a degree in physical education, and her future stretched before her like an open road. Those who knew Amy described her as vibrant, athletic, and full of life. She was the kind of person who lit up a room when she entered, whose smile was genuine and infectious, whose energy seemed boundless. At 5 feet 7 inches tall with distinctive tattoos, including a Tasmanian devil on her shoulder, a sun on her lower back, and a gecko on her navel, Amy had a presence that people remembered. Her blonde hair and blue-green eyes gave her a striking appearance, but it was her personality that truly defined her. She was caring, adventurous, and deeply connected to her family. The relationship between Amy and her brother Brad was particularly close. They had grown up together in Petersburg, Virginia, sharing the ordinary moments that build a lifetime of connection. They teased each other, protected each other, and maintained the kind of sibling bond that weathers all seasons. Brad knew his sister's moods, her habits, her patterns. He could tell when something was bothering her, when she was truly happy, when she needed space or companionship. This familiarity, this intimate knowledge of who Amy was, would become both a source of comfort and torment in the days to come. The Rhapsody of the Seas departed from San Juan, Puerto Rico on March 25, 1998. The ship was massive, a floating city that housed more than 2,000 passengers and nearly 1,000 crew members. It offered every many imaginable restaurants, bars, swimming pools, a casino, entertainment venues, shops, and endless corridors that twisted through its interior like a labyrinth. For first-time cruisers, the sheer size of the vessel could be overwhelming. The Bradley family's stateroom was located on the upper decks, offering them a balcony where they could watch the ocean roll by, where they could feel the salt air on their faces and listen to the endless conversation between wind and water. The first days of the cruise passed exactly as the Bradleys had hoped. They explored the ship, participated in activities, enjoyed elaborate meals, and soaked in the Caribbean sun. Amy, athletic and energetic, spent time at the ship's gym, maintaining the fitness regimen that had always been important to her. She and Brad played basketball on the sports deck, their competitive spirits emerging in friendly matches. The family attended shows together, laughed over dinner, and took photographs that captured their smiles, their togetherness, their happiness. These were the moments they would treasure, the memories they thought would define this trip. On March 23rd, The ship docked in Aruba, and the Bradley family went ashore to explore the island. They walked through the colorful streets, browsed local shops, and experienced the unique blend of Dutch and Caribbean culture that defines Aruba. Amy was relaxed, enjoying the warmth and the novelty of being somewhere so different from Virginia. She bought a few souvenirs, took pictures, and seemed completely at ease. There was nothing unusual about her behavior, nothing that suggested she was troubled or planning anything out of the ordinary. She was simply a young woman on vacation with her family, savoring the experience. That evening, back on the ship, the Bradley family attended the farewell dinner, a tradition on the final night before the cruise returned to its port of origin. The dining room was filled with passengers celebrating the end of their journey, sharing stories about the places they'd visited and the experiences they'd had. The Bradleys were in good spirits, already talking about the next vacation they might take together, already making plans for the future. After dinner, they decided to attend the ship's evening show, a musical performance that received enthusiastic reviews from other passengers. The show was entertaining, a professional production with talented performers, elaborate costumes, and music that ranged from contemporary hits to classic favorites. Amy and her family enjoyed it, clapping along with the rest of the audience, appreciating the effort and skill on display. When the show ended around 10:30 in the evening, they made their way through the crowds of passengers dispersing throughout the ship. Some people headed to the casino, others to various bars and lounges, still others back to their cabins to rest before the next day's disembarkation. The Bradleys weren't quite ready to call it a night. The ship's disco was in full swing, the bass-heavy music audible even from the corridors outside. Brad suggested they check it out, and Amy agreed. Ron and Iva decided to skip the disco, preferring to return to their cabin and relax. They bid their children good night, reminding them not to stay out too late, the kind of casual parental instruction that seemed unnecessary for adults in their 20s, but came naturally nonetheless. Amy and Brad headed to the disco together. The disco was crowded, hot, and loud. Colored lights flashed across the dance floor, where passengers of all ages moved to the rhythm of music that seemed to vibrate through the floor itself. The air was thick with the mingled scents of cologne, perfume, and the faint musk that comes with any enclosed space filled with too many people. Amy and Brad found a spot and began to dance, letting the music carry them, enjoying the freedom and energy of the moment. This was vacation. This was what they'd come for. This unstructured time to simply be young and alive. It was in the disco that Amy caught the attention of the ship's band members. The band, a group of young men who performed regularly on the cruise, had finished their set and were now mingling with passengers, enjoying the party atmosphere. One member in particular, a bass player named Alistair Douglas, known to everyone as Yellow, took notice of Amy. He approached her and Brad, striking up a conversation that began casually enough. He complimented Amy on her dancing, asked where they were from, engaged in the kind of small talk that happens in such settings. His bandmates joined the conversation, and soon Amy and Brad were part of a larger group, laughing and talking over the music. Yellow seemed particularly interested in Amy, his attention focused on her in a way that Brad noticed, but didn't initially find concerning. This was a social environment, after all, and people naturally gravitated toward those they found attractive or interesting. Amy was friendly, engaging in the conversation without any apparent discomfort. She wasn't flirting aggressively or acting inappropriately. She was simply being herself, social and polite. The band members seemed harmless enough, professional entertainers who probably interacted with passengers this way all the time. As the night wore on, Brad began to feel tired. The combination of sun activity and alcohol from earlier in the evening was catching up with him. He glanced at his watch and saw it was approaching 1:30 in the morning. He suggested to Amy that they should probably head back to the cabin, but Amy wasn't ready to leave yet. She was still energized, still enjoying the music and the company. She assured Brad that she would be fine, that she would head back to the cabin soon, that he didn't need to worry about her. This was not unusual behavior for Amy. She was 23 years old, responsible and capable, perfectly able to take care of herself. Brad reluctantly agreed, reminding her of their cabin number as if she might have forgotten, and made his way through the crowd toward the exit. Brad returned to the family's cabin around 1:30 in the morning. His parents were already asleep, and he quietly prepared for bed, expecting Amy to return within the next hour or so. He fell asleep without concern, assuming his sister would come back. When approximately 5:15 in the morning on March 24, 1998, Ron Bradley woke up. He was an early riser by habit, someone whose internal clock functioned with military precision regardless of where was or how late he'd stilled up. The cabin was still dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of dawn beginning to break outside. Ron got up quietly, not wanting to disturb his wife or children, and stepped out onto the balcony to enjoy the morning air. The ocean at dawn is a sight of particular beauty. The water takes on colors that don't exist at any other time of day, shades of purple and pink and gold that seem almost unreal. The air is cool and clean, not yet warmed by the sun, and there's a stillness that feels sacred, as if the world is taking a breath before beginning again. Ron stood on the balcony, his hands on the railing looking out at the endless expanse of water. The ship was moving steadily, making its way back toward Curaçao, where it would dock later that morning before the final leg of the journey back to San Juan. Ron's peace was interrupted when he happened to glance toward the upper deck area of the ship. He could see the chairs and tables arranged there, could make out the shapes of early morning joggers and crew member day. And there, sitting in a chair with someone, was a figure that looked like Amy. She was with a man, and even from a distance Ron could tell they were in conversation. He couldn't hear what they were saying, couldn't make out the details of their interaction, but something about the scene struck him as odd. It was very early in the morning, an unusual time for Amy to be awake and socializing. Ron watched for a moment, trying to decide if he should be concerned. Amy was an adult, certainly capable of making her own decisions about who she spent time with and when. But there was something about the man's body language that bothered Ron, something he couldn't quite articulate, but that triggered his paternal instincts. The man seemed too close to Amy, too familiar. Ron considered going up to check on her but decided against it, not wanting to embarrass her or seem overbearing. He told himself she was fine, that she would come back to the cabin soon, that he was probably overreacting. Ron went back inside the cabin and tried to go back to sleep, but he found himself restless. He couldn't shake the image of Amy sitting with that man. Couldn't quiet the small voice in his head that suggested something wasn't right. After tossing and turning for a while, he got up again around 6 in the morning and went back out to the balcony. This time he didn't see Amy anywhere. The chairs where she had been sitting were empty. The deck was still relatively quiet, with only a few people visible here and there. Ron assumed Amy had returned to the cabin while he was trying to sleep. He stepped back inside and looked toward the sleeping area where Amy's bed was located. The bed was empty, Amy wasn't there. Ron felt the first stirring of real concern. He checked the bathroom, thinking perhaps she was in there, but it was empty as well. He gently woke Iva and asked if she'd seen Amy come in. Iva, disoriented from sleep, said she hadn't seen her. Ron then woke Brad and asked him when Amy had returned from the disco. Brad, still groggy, said he'd left Amy at the disco around 1:30 and assumed she'd come back to the cabin afterward. He hadn't heard her come in, but he'd been sleeping soundly and might have missed it. Ron told Brad about seeing Amy on the deck earlier that morning, about the man she'd been with, about how she was now nowhere to be found. Brad became alert immediately, the fog of sleep evaporating in an instant. Together they began searching the cabin more thoroughly, looking in every possible place Amy could be, even places that made no logical sense. By 6:30 in the morning, the Bradley family's concern had escalated into something approaching panic. Amy was not on the balcony, was not anywhere they could see or reach. They decided to search the ship, splitting up to cover more ground. Brad went to the disco, thinking perhaps Amy had fallen asleep there or was still talking with the band members. The disco was closed, dark and empty except for cleaning crew preparing it for the next voyage. Brad asked the crew if they'd seen a young blonde woman, described Amy in detail. but received only head shakes and apologetic shrugs. Ron and Iva searched other areas of the ship, the pools, the gym, the restaurants, anywhere Amy might have gone. They asked other passengers if they'd seen her, showed the photograph they'd taken of her earlier in the cruise, but no one had seen anyone matching her description that morning. The ship was enormous, with thousands of places a person could be, and searching it felt like trying to find a single grain of sand on a beach. Every corridor looked the same, every deck seemed to blend into the next, and the anxiety building in Ron and Iva's chests made it difficult to think clearly. By 7 in the morning, the Bradley family made the decision to notify the ship's security. They approached the guest services desk and explained that their daughter was missing, that they hadn't seen her since the early morning hours, that this was completely unlike her. The crew members at the desk tried to reassure them, suggesting that Amy had probably just found a quiet place to sleep or had met someone and lost track of time. These kinds of misunderstandings happened on cruises, they said. Young people enjoying themselves sometimes forgot to check in with their families. She would turn up soon, they were certain. But the Bradleys knew this explanation didn't fit. Amy wasn't the type to disappear without telling anyone, wasn't the type to be so inconsiderate as to worry her family like this. Something was wrong, and they needed the crew to take this seriously. They insisted that a full search of the ship be conducted immediately. The ship's security agreed, though with a measured urgency that suggested they still believed this would resolve itself quickly. The Rhapsody of the Seas was scheduled to dock in Cura at 8 in the morning. The ship's captain was notified of the situation, and the decision was made to delay disembarkation while a thorough search was conducted. Crew members spread throughout the ship, checking every public area, every storage room, every restricted section. They searched the decks, the theaters, the crew quarters, the engine rooms, the laundry facilities. They looked in lifeboats, in storage closets behind equipment. They asked every crew member on duty if they'd seen Amy, if they'd noticed anything unusual during the night. As the search progressed, passengers began to notice that something was amiss. The usual morning announcements about breakfast and shore excursions were replaced with requests for anyone who had seen Amy Lynn Bradley to come forward. Her description was given over the ship's public address system: 23 years old, 5 feet 7 inches tall, blonde hair, blue-green eyes, approximately 120 pounds, with distinctive tattoos. If anyone had any information, they were asked to contact ship security immediately. The Bradley family waited in agonizing limbo as the search continued. Every minute felt like an hour, every negative report from the search teams like a physical blow. Brad kept replaying his last conversation with Amy in his mind, wondering if he should have insisted she come back to the cabin with him, wondering if he'd missed some sign that she was in trouble. Ron couldn't stop thinking about the man he'd seen with Amy on the deck, couldn't stop wondering who he was and what they'd been talking about. Iva felt herself fragmenting, her mind refusing to accept the possibilities that were beginning to form. By 9 in the morning, the ship had been searched as thoroughly as possible, and Amy had not been found. She was not in her cabin, not in any public area, not in any restricted section of the vessel. She had seemingly vanished without a trace. The ship's captain faced a decision: continue to Curaçao as planned or remain at sea and continue searching. The authorities in Curaçao were contacted, and the decision was made to dock so that local law enforcement could become involved. The Rhapsody of the Seas docked in Curaçao late in the morning, hours behind schedule. Curaçao authorities boarded the ship and began their own investigation. They interviewed the Bradley family, taking detailed statements about Amy's last known whereabouts, about her behavior leading up to her disappearance, about any unusual interactions she'd had during the cruise. Ron told them about seeing Amy on the deck with a man in the early morning hours. Brad told them about leaving Amy at the disco with the band members. They described Amy in exhaustive detail, not just her physical appearance but who she was as a person, hoping that somehow this information would help locate her. The authorities questioned the ship's crew, particularly the band members who had been seen interacting with Amy. Yellow and his fellow musicians were brought in for interviews. Yellow confirmed that he and his bandmates had talked with Amy and Brad at the disco, said they'd been friendly and conversational, but nothing inappropriate. He claimed that Amy had left the disco sometime around 3 in the morning, that she'd said she was going back to her cabin, that he hadn't seen her after that. The other band members corroborated his story, all of them presenting a consistent narrative about a pleasant but unremarkable interaction. The authorities asked about the man Ron had seen with Amy on the deck. Yellow denied being that man, said he'd gone to his own quarters after the disco closed and had been asleep during the early morning hours. His bandmates supported this claim. Without any way to definitively identify the man Ron had seen, this lead seemed to evaporate before it could be properly pursued. Curaçao's waters were searched. Coast Guard vessels and local boats combed the areas around where the ship had been traveling, looking for any sign that Amy might have gone overboard. The possibility that she had fallen or jumped from the ship was considered, though her family vehemently rejected this idea. Amy had no reason to harm herself, they insisted. She was happy, had everything to live for, had shown no signs of depression or suicidal ideation, and Amy was a strong swimmer, an athlete who would have been able to survive in the water for some time if she'd gone overboard accidentally. Surely someone would have heard a splash. Surely she would have cried out for help. But the ocean keeps its secrets well. If Amy had gone into the water during the night, if she had done so far enough from the ship that her cries weren't heard, the current could have carried her far from the ship's path. The search covered as much area as possible, but the Caribbean is vast, and finding a single person in all that water is nearly impossible. Days passed with no sign of Amy, no body recovered, no evidence found. The Bradley family refused to leave Curaçao, while other passengers disembarked and flew home. While the rhapsody of the seas eventually continued on without them, the Bradleys remained on the island, setting up a makeshift command center in their hotel room. They contacted the FBI, asking for assistance, pleading for resources that might help find their daughter. They contacted the U.S. State Department. They contacted anyone who might have the power to help. Ron and Brad began their own investigation, walking the streets of Curaçao, showing Amy's photograph to anyone who would look at it, asking if anyone had seen her. The island's ports, bars, hotels, and businesses were canvassed repeatedly. The Bradleys created flyers with Amy's picture and description, offering a reward for information leading to her whereabouts. They plastered these flyers everywhere they could, desperate for someone to come forward with something, anything that might help. In those early days, the prevailing theory among some investigators was that Amy had either fallen overboard or had voluntarily left the ship in Curaçao, perhaps to meet someone or start a new life. The Bradley family rejected both theories completely. Amy would never abandon them without a word, would never cause them this kind of anguish. She had no reason to disappear, no problems she was running from, no secret life they were unaware of. They knew their daughter, and they knew something terrible had happened to her. As the days turned into weeks, tips began to come in. Some were well-meaning but ultimately useless, sightings of blonde women who bore only the slightest resemblance to Amy. Others were more disturbing, suggesting possibilities that the family didn't want to consider but couldn't afford to ignore. There were whispers about human trafficking, about young women being taken from cruise ships and sold into forced labor or sexual slavery. These whispers seemed like something from a movie, too horrible to be real. But the Bradleys learned that such things did happen, that the Caribbean had networks of criminals engaged in exactly these kinds of activities. One tip that came in during those early weeks would prove particularly significant. A Canadian tourist claimed to have seen Amy at a beach resort in Curaçao just days after her disappearance. The woman, Jody Maurer, said she'd been approached by a young woman who fit Amy's description, who had asked for help, who had seemed distressed. Before Judy could fully process what was happening or respond, two men had intervened, pulling the young woman away and hurrying her into a vehicle. Judy reported this incident to authorities, but by the time investigators followed up, there was no trace of the woman or the men. This sighting gave the Bradley family both hope and horror. Hope that Amy was alive, that she was somewhere on Curaçao and could still be found. horror at the implications of what Judy Moore had witnessed, at the suggestion that Amy was being held against her will, that she was trying to escape from someone. The authorities took this lead seriously, increasing their search efforts on the island, questioning more people, looking more carefully at the local criminal underworld. But weeks passed without finding Amy. The search continued, the investigation remained active, but leads dried up and progress stalled. The Bradleys exhausted their savings staying in Curacao, spending every dollar they had on private investigators, reward money, and efforts to keep Amy's case in the public eye. Ron and Iva aged years in those months. The stress and grief carving lines into their faces, stealing sleep from their nights, replacing their daughter's laughter with endless silence. Brad struggled with guilt, replaying that night in the disco over and over, wondering what would have happened if he'd insisted Amy leave with him, if he'd stayed with her, if he'd been more alert to potential danger. He knew rationally that he couldn't have predicted what would happen, that Amy was an adult who made her own choices. But rationality provides little comfort when someone you love has vanished. The investigation into Amy's disappearance quickly became complicated by jurisdictional issues that frustrated everyone involved. Because Amy had vanished from a cruise ship in international waters, determining who had primary responsibility for the investigation was not straightforward. The ship was registered in Norway, owned by a company based in Miami, and had been traveling between various Caribbean nations when Amy disappeared. The FBI had an interest because Amy was an American citizen, but their jurisdiction was limited. Curacao authorities were involved because the ship had been in their waters and had docked at their port, but they had limited resources for such an investigation. Royal Caribbean, the cruise line, conducted their own internal investigation, but the Bradley family questioned whether the company was more interested in protecting its reputation than in finding the truth. This bureaucratic maze meant that crucial evidence may have been lost or overlooked in those first critical hours and days. The ship's security footage, which might have shown Amy's movements after she left the disco, was handled inconsistently. Some footage was reviewed, some was not. Some was preserved, some was recorded over. The ship continued its regular schedule after leaving Curacao, meaning that crew members and potential witnesses dispersed across the world, returning to their home countries or moving on to other assignments. Tracking them down later became exponentially more difficult. The Bradley family learned harsh lessons about how cruise ship investigations work. They discovered that cruise lines operate in a largely self-regulated environment, that ships at sea exist in a kind of legal gray area where oversight is minimal and accountability is difficult to enforce. They learned that when someone disappears from a cruise ship, the most critical window for investigation is incredibly brief, and once that window closes, recovering the truth becomes almost impossible. These realizations filled them with rage and frustration, emotions that had nowhere productive to go, that could only be channeled into their continued search for Amy. Royal Caribbean's response to the situation became a source of tension. The company initially seemed cooperative, providing the Bradley family with support and expressing concern about Amy's disappearance. But as the investigation dragged on and media attention increased, the relationship deteriorated. The Bradleys felt that Royal Caribbean was more concerned with limiting their liability and protecting their brand than with finding out what happened to their daughter. The company maintained that they had followed all proper procedures, that their crew had conducted a thorough search, that they had cooperated fully with authorities. The Bradleys saw it differently, believing that crucial mistakes had been made in those first hours, mistakes that might have cost Amy her life or her freedom. As months passed with no resolution, the case began to attract attention from media outlets and missing persons organizations. Amy's story was featured on news programs and newspapers, and on websites dedicated to unsolved disappearances. Her parents gave interview after interview, always hoping that the right person would see Amy's face and come forward with information. They appeared on television shows, their grief raw and visible, pleading with anyone who knew anything to contact them or the authorities. The media attention brought both benefits and complications. On the positive side, it kept Amy's case in the public consciousness, increased the likelihood that someone with information might come forward, and put pressure on authorities to continue investigating. On the negative side, it attracted opportunists and attention seekers who provided false leads, wasted investigative resources, and gave the family false hope. Psychics contacted the Bradleys claiming to know where Amy was, describing visions that ranged from the vague to the specific, all of them ultimately useless. Con artists posed as people with information, trying to extract money from a desperate family. Well-meaning but mistaken people called in sightings that sent investigators chasing ghosts across multiple countries. The Bradley family learned to filter through this noise, to identify which leads seemed credible and which were clearly fabrications. They worked with the FBI to establish protocols for handling tips, to verify information before getting emotionally invested in it. But every phone call that came in, every email that arrived, carried the possibility of being one that would bring Amy home, so they couldn't allow themselves to become completely cynical or dismissive. They existed in a constant state of cautious hope, ready to pursue any lead while trying to protect themselves from the crushing disappointment that followed most of them. In 1999, approximately a year after Amy's disappearance, another significant sighting was reported. This one came from a United States Navy petty officer named David Carmichael who had been on shore leaving Curacao. Carmichael reported that he had visited a brothel in the port area and had seen a woman there who he was convinced was Amy Lynn Bradley. He said the woman had approached him and had distinctly said, "I'm Amy Bradley," before being quickly pulled away by handlers who watched the women in the establishment closely. Carmichael described the woman as having the same tattoos Amy had, the Tasmanian devil, the sun, the gecko. He was disturbed enough by the encounter to report it when he returned to his ship, though there was a delay between when he saw the woman and when he made the official report. This sighting was particularly credible because Carmichael was a trained military observer with no apparent reason to fabricate such a story. He provided a detailed account of what he'd seen, described the location of the brothel, and submitted to questioning by investigators. The FBI took this lead seriously, as did the Bradley family. The possibility that Amy was being held in sexual slavery was nightmarish, but if it was true, it meant she was alive and could potentially be rescued. Investigators raided several establishments in Curaçao's red light district, looking for Amy or anyone who might have information about her. They questioned workers, managers, and customers. They showed Amy's photograph and description around the area, but they found nothing conclusive. Either Amy had been moved before the raids occurred, or Carmichael had been mistaken, or the people in those establishments were too frightened or too well paid to cooperate with authorities. The brothel industry in that area was controlled by dangerous people, organized crime figures who did not hesitate to use violence to protect their interests. Witnesses who might have come forward in other circumstances chose silence when speaking up could cost them their lives. The Bradley family was devastated by this development. The idea that Amy might be trapped in such a situation, subjected to unspeakable abuse, suffering while they couldn't reach her, was almost unbearable. Iva Bradley, in particular, struggled with the psychological toll of imagining what her daughter might be enduring. The not knowing was its own form of torture, the mind filling in blanks with the worst possible scenarios, playing them on endless loop. Ron became consumed with the investigation, spending every waking moment thinking of Amy, who to contact next, what stone remained unturned. Brad, now in his mid-20s, found his own life frozen in place. How could he move forward when his sister was missing? How could he pursue normal goals like career advancement or starting a family when Amy's fate remained unknown? He carried the weight of being the last family member to see her, the last person who could have prevented whatever happened from happening. His parents never blamed him, never suggested that he should have done anything differently, but Brad blamed himself enough for all of them. In August 1999, another tip came in that would prove even more disturbing and controversial than the previous ones. A man contacted the Bradley family claiming to have photographs of Amy taken after her disappearance. The man, who would only identify himself through intermediaries, said these photographs showed Amy in compromising positions, that they were being used to advertise her services in the sex trafficking industry. He said he could provide these photographs to the family, but wanted money in exchange, claiming he was taking a risk by coming forward and needed compensation. The FBI became involved in managing this contact. The situation was delicate and potentially dangerous. If the man genuinely had photographs of Amy, they could be crucial evidence, might help locate her, might provide information about who was holding her and where. But paying for the photographs could constitute buying evidence, could potentially fund criminal activity, and could encourage other extortionists to come forward with false claims. Additionally, if the photographs were authentic, viewing them would be traumatic for the family, would show their daughter in circumstances no parent should ever have to witness. After careful consideration and with law enforcement, the decision was made to pursue this lead. The photographs were obtained, though the exact circumstances of how this transaction occurred have never been fully disclosed to the public. When investigators and the Bradley family reviewed the photographs, they were confronted with images that were deeply disturbing. The photographs showed a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Amy, who had similar tattoos in similar locations, who appeared to be in some kind of brothel or hotel room setting. The images were pornographic in nature, designed to advertise sexual services. The question that immediately arose was whether the woman in the photographs was actually Amy or someone who looked similar to her. The Bradley family believed it was Amy. They pointed to specific details, the exact placement and appearance of the tattoos, the shape of her face, distinctive features they recognized. They were convinced beyond any doubt that they were looking at their daughter, that she was alive somewhere being exploited and abused. However, forensic experts who analyzed the photographs were unable to make a definitive determination. The image quality was not perfect, and while there were certainly similarities between the woman in the photographs and Amy, there were also some differences that could not be easily explained. The tattoos appeared similar but not identical in every detail. Some facial features matched while others seemed slightly different. The analysts concluded that the woman could be Amy, but that they could not confirm it with absolute certainty. This ambiguity would plague the case for years to come. Becoming one of its most contentious aspects, the FBI attempted to trace the origin of the photographs, to determine where they had been taken and who had taken them. This proved extremely difficult. The photographs had been circulated on adult websites, had been passed through multiple hands, had been copied and distributed in ways that obscured their original source. The metadata that might have indicated when and where the images were created had been stripped away. Investigators worked backward through the chain of possession, but it led them into a murky world of offshore websites, anonymous servers, and people who communicated only through encrypted channels. What the investigators did learn was that there was indeed a sex trafficking network operating in the Caribbean, that young women were being taken and forced into prostitution, that these operations were run by sophisticated criminal organizations with connections throughout the region. They learned that cruise ship ports were sometimes used as hunting grounds, that women traveling alone or who became separated from their groups could be targeted, that these victims could be moved quickly between islands, making them nearly impossible to track. This confirmed the Bradley family's worst fears about what might have happened to Amy. The investigation expanded to include multiple countries and agencies. The FBI's Crimes Against Children and Human Trafficking Task Force became involved. Interpol was contacted to help coordinate efforts across international boundaries. Law enforcement in multiple Caribbean nations were briefed on Amy's case and asked to be alert for any sign of her. The U.S. State Department put pressure on foreign governments to take the matter seriously, to dedicate resources to the search, but sex trafficking investigations are notoriously difficult. The victims are hidden, moved frequently, and often controlled through a combination of physical violence, psychological manipulation, and substance dependency that makes them unable or unwilling to seek help. The perpetrators are violent, well-funded, and experienced in evading law enforcement. They have lawyers, they have connections to corrupt officials, they have systems in place to destroy evidence and intimidate witnesses. Going up against such organizations requires resources, time, and coordination that often exceeds what is available to any single law enforcement agency. The Bradley family, meanwhile, continued their own efforts. They hired private investigators who specialized in human trafficking cases, men and women who had experience working in the underworld, where Amy might be hidden. These investigators traveled throughout the Caribbean, made contact with informants, paid for information, and took risks that police officers bound by regulations could not take. Some of what they learned was encouraging, suggesting that Amy might indeed be alive. Other information was contradictory or impossible to verify. They operated in a world of shadows and half-truths, where everyone had an agenda and trust was a luxury no one could afford. Ron Bradley became particularly active in this underground investigation. He traveled repeatedly to Curaçao and other Caribbean islands, meeting with people in bars and back alleys, showing Amy's photograph, offering money for credible information. He put himself in dangerous situations, meeting with individuals connected to criminal enterprises, making it clear that he would do whatever it took to find his daughter. Some of these encounters were productive, yielding small pieces of information that might fit into the larger puzzle. Others were dead ends or deliberate misdirection by people trying to exploit a desperate father. The emotional cost of these efforts on Ron was severe. He was no longer the man he had been before March 24, 1998. That man who had looked forward to a peaceful retirement, who had enjoyed simple pleasures and family gatherings, who had assumed the world was basically fair and that justice could be relied upon, was gone. In his place was someone harder, more cynical, driven by a singular purpose that consumed everything else in his life. His health suffered. His relationships outside of the immediate family withered. Everything was sacrificed on the altar of finding Amy. Iva coped differently but suffered no less. She maintained the family home, created a room dedicated to Amy's case where every piece of evidence, every photograph, every lead was organized and preserved. She coordinated with missing persons organizations, kept meticulous records of every tip and sighting, managed the reward fund, and served as the family's liaison with media outlets. Where Ron channeled his grief into aggressive action, Iva channeled hers into methodical documentation and advocacy. She refused to let Amy be forgotten, refused to let the case go cold, refused to accept that her daughter was lost forever. The family's financial resources were depleted by their efforts. Ron and Iva spent their retirement savings, took out loans, mortgaged their house. They paid private investigators, offered reward money, funded travel expenses, and covered the costs of producing and distributing missing person materials. Well, meaning friends and family members sometimes suggested they needed to accept reality, to move on with their lives, to stop pouring money into an investigation that might never yield results. But how does a parent move on when their child is missing? How does one accept that reality when accepting it means abandoning hope? In 2002, another reported sighting occurred that seemed to corroborate the trafficking theory. A woman contacted the Bradley family claiming she had seen Amy in a hotel in Barbados. The witness said a group of 3 women had come to the hotel, accompanied by 2 men who never left their side. One of the women had looked directly at the witness and had mouthed the words, "Help me," though she had not spoken aloud. The witness described this woman as having blonde hair, distinctive tattoos, and an American appearance. She said the woman's expression was one of desperation and fear. By the time this sighting was reported and investigated, the group had left the hotel. Staff members were questioned, security footage was reviewed, but the trail went cold quickly. The witness provided a description of the men with the women, but it was too general to be useful. They were described as Hispanic or possibly Middle Eastern, well-dressed, authoritative in their bearing. This description could have fit thousands of men in the Caribbean. Without more specific information, there was no way to track them down. This sighting, like the others before it, gave the Bradley family reason to believe Amy was alive, but also highlighted the agonizing impossibility of their situation. If Amy was being trafficked, she was being kept hidden, moved around, watched constantly by people who would not hesitate to harm her, or anyone who tried to help her. Even if she managed to signal for help, as this sighting suggested she had tried to do. The window of opportunity was measured in seconds, and by the time authorities could respond, she would be gone again. The psychological warfare of living with this knowledge was brutal. Every day brought the possibility of a breakthrough, but also brought the reality of continued absence. Hope and despair became intertwined, impossible to separate. The family existed in a state of perpetual tension, always waiting for news, always braced for disappointment, always trying to maintain belief in the face of overwhelming odds. The media coverage of Amy's case had evolved over the years. In the immediate aftermath of her disappearance, the focus had been on the mystery of how someone could vanish from a cruise ship. As the trafficking theory emerged, the coverage shifted to broader questions about cruise ship security and the sex trafficking industry in the Caribbean. Amy's case became emblematic of larger issues, a symbol of the dangers that lurked beneath the surface of the tourist paradise the Caribbean islands presented to the world. This broader coverage brought Amy's case to the attention of anti-trafficking organizations, human rights advocates, and policymakers. Congressional hearings were held about security on cruise ships. Legislation was proposed to increase oversight and improve reporting requirements when passengers went missing. The Bradleys testified before Congress, sharing their story, advocating for changes that might prevent other families from experiencing what they had endured. Their pain served a purpose, became a catalyst for reform. Though this was cold comfort when Amy remained missing. In 2005, 7 years after Amy's disappearance, the case was featured on the television program, America's Most Wanted. The episode presented Amy's story to millions of viewers, showed age-progressed photographs of what she might look like as a 30-year-old woman, and provided information about how to contact authorities with tips. The response was significant, generating hundreds of new leads that had to be investigated and assessed. Most led nowhere, but the family was grateful for the attention, hopeful that somewhere among those hundreds of calls might be the one that mattered. One of the tips that came in after the America's Most Wanted episode would prove to be among the most detailed and disturbing yet received. A former U.S. military member who requested anonymity contacted investigators claiming to have specific information about Amy's fate. This individual said that during his time stationed in the Caribbean, he had come across information through contacts in local law enforcement and intelligence communities suggesting that Amy had been kidnapped from the cruise ship by an organized trafficking ring that operated specifically in the cruise port areas. According to this source, the operation worked by having spotters on cruise ships who would identify potential targets, women traveling alone or who became separated from their groups. These targets would be befriended by crew members or other passengers who were part of the network. At an opportune moment, the target would be drugged, removed from the ship, and transferred to handlers on shore, who would then transport them to locations where they would be forced into prostitution. The source claimed this network had connections to corrupt officials, who would ensure that investigations went nowhere, that evidence disappeared, that witnesses were intimidated or bribed into silence. This information aligned with much of what the Bradley family and investigators had already suspected or uncovered, but hearing it laid out so explicitly was chilling. The source went on to say that he believed Amy had been taken to Colombia or Venezuela, where the trafficking networks were particularly well established and brutal. He suggested that victims in this situation were often kept addicted to drugs to make them compliant, were moved frequently to prevent them from forming connections or learning enough about their location to escape, and were threatened with violence against their families if they tried to seek help. The FBI attempted to verify this information to determine whether the source was credible and whether his claims could be substantiated. Some elements of his account checked out, matching details about known trafficking operations in the region. Other elements were harder to confirm, existing in that murky space where intelligence gathering meets hearsay, where what people know and what they can prove are very different things. The source claimed his information came from conversations with local police and criminals, from things he'd observed and pieced together, but he had no direct evidence that could be used to mount a rescue operation or secure a conviction. Nevertheless, This tip prompted renewed investigative efforts in South America. The FBI worked with law enforcement in Colombia and Venezuela, sharing Amy's information, asking for assistance in searching for her. But both countries faced their own internal security challenges, with limited resources to dedicate to finding one American woman, who may or may not be within their borders. The vastness of these countries, the number of places she could be hidden, the power of the criminal organizations that controlled the trafficking networks, all of it made the task feel almost hopeless. Ron Bradley traveled to Colombia on several occasions, despite warnings from the FBI that doing so was dangerous. He met with local investigators, hired local private detectives, distributed flyers in areas known for prostitution, and made contact with organizations that work to rescue trafficking victims. Some of these trips yielded small fragments of information. Unverified reports of American women being held in certain locations, claims that someone had seen someone who matched Amy's description. But every time investigators followed up on these leads, they found nothing concrete. The women who had been seen were gone by the time authorities arrived, or they turned out to be other missing persons, or the sightings proved to be mistaken identity. The danger Ron faced during these trips was real. He was threatened more than once by people who made it clear that asking too many questions in certain neighborhoods could have fatal consequences. He was followed, his hotel room was broken into, and on one occasion he was confronted by men who suggested that continuing his search would result in him disappearing, just like his daughter had. But Ron could not be deterred. The threats only convinced him further that Amy was caught in this world, that the reaction of these criminals meant he was getting close to something they wanted to keep hidden. The Bradley family's crusade had by this point consumed more than a decade. Brad had gone from a young man in his early 20s to someone in his mid-30s, his entire adult life defined by his sister's absence. He had tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, had pursued a career and relationships, but everything was colored by the shadow of what had happened. Holidays were torture. Amy's birthday was unbearable, and the anniversary of her disappearance marked the calendar like a scar that never healed. The family's relationships with extended family members and friends had changed. Some people remained supportive throughout the ordeal, understanding that the Bradleys' lives were on hold until Amy was found. Others drifted away, uncomfortable with the intensity of the family's grief, unable to know what to say or how to help, preferring to maintain distance from pain they couldn't fix. The Bradleys didn't blame them, understanding that most people are not equipped to deal with this level of ongoing trauma, but the isolation added another layer of difficulty to an already impossible situation. There were moments when the family wondered if they should give up, if they should accept that Amy was gone and try to reclaim some portion of normal life. These thoughts were fleeting, guilty, quickly pushed aside. How could they abandon Amy when she might be alive, might be suffering, might be waiting for them to rescue her? How could they choose their own peace of mind over the possibility, however remote, of bringing her home? They couldn't, and so they continued. The photographs that had been obtained years earlier remained a focal point of debate. The Bradley family periodically released statements affirming their belief that the woman in the images was Amy, asking anyone with information about where or when the photographs were taken to come forward. Skeptics, including some in law enforcement and media, questioned whether the identification was accurate, whether grieving parents were seeing what they desperately wanted to see rather than what was objectively there. Forensic analysts were brought in multiple times over the years to re-examine the photographs using advancing technology. Each new analysis brought the same frustratingly inconclusive results. The woman in the photographs could be Amy Bradley, but definitive confirmation was impossible. The tattoos were similar, but photographs of tattoos can be difficult to compare with absolute certainty, especially when image quality is less than perfect and when tattoos can fade, be modified, or be artificially replicated. Facial recognition technology of the era was not sophisticated enough to provide certainty, particularly when comparing images taken years apart and under vastly different circumstances. What added to the family's conviction that the photographs showed Amy was the presence of all three of her distinctive tattoos in the correct locations. The odds of another woman having a Tasmanian devil on her shoulder, a sun on her lower back, and a gecko on her navel seemed astronomically small. The family argued that this could not be coincidence, that these specific markers proved the woman's identity beyond reasonable doubt. Skeptics countered that the trafficking networks were sophisticated enough to create false evidence, that if they wanted to extort money from desperate families, they could doctor images or find women with similar tattoos, that the photographs might be a cruel hoax rather than genuine evidence. This debate was never fully resolved. The photographs existed in a liminal space, neither definitively proving alive nor proving she wasn't. They became both evidence and torture. Something the family returned to again and again, studying every pixel, looking for something they might have missed, hoping for some detail that would transform possibility into certainty. In 2007, nearly a decade after Amy's disappearance, the Bradley family made the difficult decision to have Amy declared legally dead. This was not an acknowledgement that they believed she was dead, but rather a necessary legal step to handle various administrative and financial matters that had been frozen since her disappearance. Insurance policies, accounts in her name, and other practical concerns required some form of legal resolution. The declaration could be reversed if Amy were found alive, which the family fully expected would happen. Nevertheless, the process of going through this legal procedure was agonizing, felt like a betrayal even though it wasn't, forced them to confront possibilities they spent every other moment denying. The hearing to declare Amy legally dead was brief and procedural. The judge expressed sympathy for the family, acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances of the case, and granted the declaration while noting that it could be vacated should Amy be located. Ron, Iva, and Brad sat in the courtroom numb and hollow, processing paperwork that meant nothing in terms of their actual beliefs about Amy's fate, but that somehow made her absence feel more official, more permanent. They left the courthouse and went immediately back to their investigation, to their search, to their refusal to give up. By this point, the case had generated significant attention in the missing persons community. Amy's disappearance had been featured on numerous television programs beyond America's Most Wanted, including Disappeared, in various news magazine shows. Her case was discussed on true crime podcasts, analyzed on forums and websites dedicated to unsolved mysteries, and included in documentaries about cruise ship safety and human trafficking. Each new piece of coverage brought a new wave of tips, some credible and some not, all of which had to be evaluated and pursued. The FBI maintained Amy's case in their active files, though the intensity of the investigation waxed and waned over the years depending on the availability of new leads and resources. Special Agent Todd Matthews, who had taken a particular interest in the case, worked with the Bradley family to ensure that Amy's information remained in every relevant database, that her DNA was on file for comparison should unidentified remains be found, that her case was presented at conferences and training sessions for law enforcement officers who might encounter her. The reward for information leading to Amy's return had grown over the years through donations and contributions from people moved by the family's plight. By 2010, the reward stood at over $200,000, a significant sum that the family hoped would motivate someone with information to come forward. Posters advertising the reward were distributed throughout the Caribbean, placed in airports, bus stations, hotels, and anywhere else travelers might see them. The family maintained a website that was updated regularly with new information, age, progress photographs, and appeals for help. Ron and Iva aged significantly during this period. The stress of the investigation, the travel, the constant emotional roller coaster of hope and disappointment, all of it took a severe toll on their health. Ron developed heart problems that his doctors directly attributed to the chronic stress he was under. Iva struggled with depression and anxiety, managed through medication that helped her function, but couldn't touch the core of her grief. They were surviving rather than living, existing in a state of suspended animation where everything waited on Amy's return. In 2010, 12 years after Amy's disappearance, another significant development occurred. A person claiming to have direct knowledge of Amy's situation contacted the Bradley family through an intermediary. This individual, who would not reveal their identity or appear in person, claimed to know where Amy was being held and offered to arrange her release in exchange for a substantial sum of money. The proposal was detailed and specific, describing a location in Venezuela where Amy was allegedly being kept, providing information about the people holding her, and outlining a plan for how her return could be accomplished. The FBI was immediately brought into the situation. This was potentially the breakthrough the family had been waiting for, but it was also exactly the kind of scenario that could be a scam designed to extract money from desperate people. The FBI's assessment was cautious. They wanted to pursue the lead but needed to verify the person's credibility before any money changed hands or any rescue operation was attempted. They worked with the family to establish communication protocols with the contact, to ask questions that would test whether this person truly had the information they claimed. The contact provided some details that seemed to check out, information about Amy that was not public knowledge, descriptions that matched what the family knew about her. But other elements of their story were vague or impossible to verify independently. The contact claimed to be afraid of people holding Amy, said they were taking an enormous risk by coming forward, and insisted that time was critical, because Amy's captors were planning to move her to a new location where she would be impossible to find. This created an agonizing dilemma for the Bradley family and the FBI. If the contact was genuine, delaying could mean losing Amy forever. But if the contact was a con artist, paying them could mean losing a substantial amount of money and encouraging other scammers to target the family. The FBI worked to set up a controlled exchange, a scenario where they could verify that the contact actually had access to Amy before any money was transferred. The contact initially agreed to this arrangement, but then began making excuses and changing the terms, raising red flags that suggested this might not be legitimate. Over several weeks, negotiations continued. The contact would provide small pieces of information, then disappear for days, then resurface with new demands or conditions. The pattern was consistent with extortion rather than genuine assistance, but the family couldn't afford to dismiss it entirely on the chance that it was real. The emotional toll of this extended uncertainty was devastating. Every day brought phone calls and messages that had to be analyzed, decisions that had to be made about how to respond, hope that flickered and dimmed and flickered again. Eventually, the contact stopped communicating altogether, disappearing without explanation. Whether they had been scared off by the FBI's involvement, whether they had never had any real information to begin with, or whether something else had happened, no one could say. The family was left once again with nothing, with the hollow ache of another false hope, another lead that had promised everything and delivered nothing. This pattern repeated itself several more times over the years. People would contact the family claiming to know where Amy was, claiming to be able to help, dangling the possibility of reunion like bait. Some of these contacts were obviously fraudulent from the beginning, crude attempts at extortion that even in their desperation the family could recognize as fake. Others were more sophisticated, more convincing, harder to dismiss. Each one required investigation, required emotional investment, required the family to open themselves up to hope, and therefore to the inevitable crash when that hope proved unfounded. The FBI warned the family repeatedly about extortion attempts, provided them with guidelines for recognizing scams, and worked to protect them from those who would exploit their grief. But the family could never completely harden themselves against these approaches, because to do so would mean potentially ignoring the one contact that might be genuine. They existed in a constant state of vulnerability, unable to fully protect themselves without also potentially abandoning Amy. Brad struggled particularly with the extortion attempts. He felt rage toward the people who would prey on his family's suffering, who would use his sister's disappearance as an opportunity for profit. He wanted to confront these people, to make them pay for the additional pain they caused. But there was no way to do so, no mechanism for justice when the perpetrators were anonymous, operating from foreign countries, untouchable by law enforcement. The powerlessness was maddening, added another layer of frustration to an already unbearable situation. Throughout all of this, the original question remained unanswered. What had actually happened to Amy Lynn Bradley on March 24, 1998? The investigation had generated numerous theories, but definitive proof of any particular scenario remained elusive. The possibilities ranged from tragic accident to calculated abduction, from voluntary disappearance to forced trafficking, each with its own supporting evidence and its own contradictions. The theory that Amy had fallen overboard accidentally was the simplest explanation, but also the one the family rejected most vehemently. Amy was an athlete, a strong swimmer, someone who would have been unlikely to fall from a cruise ship accidentally. The railings were high enough that falling over them required either climbing on them or some kind of forceful impact. There had been no evidence of a struggle on the ship, no signs that Amy had been in a fight or had been pushed. If she had gone overboard accidentally, presumably she would have been seen by someone, would have cried out, would have left some trace of her presence. The ship had been searched thoroughly, and nothing suggested she had been near the railings in a dangerous manner. The theory that Amy had jumped intentionally was even more firmly rejected by those who knew her. Amy had no history of mental illness, no indication of suicidal ideation, no reason anyone could identify for wanting to end her life. She was happy during the cruise, had been looking forward to graduating from college and starting her career, had plans for her future. Her behavior in the hours before her disappearance had been normal, even joyful. She had been dancing, socializing, enjoying herself. Nothing in her demeanor suggested someone contemplating suicide. The theory that Amy had voluntarily left the ship to start a new life made no sense to anyone who knew her. She was close to her family, had strong relationships with her parents and brother, had friends and connections back home. She had no debts she was running from, no enemies she was hiding from, no reason to abandon her entire life. If she had wanted to leave for some reason, she could have simply ended the vacation early and gone home. The idea that she would disappear without a trace, causing her family unimaginable suffering, was completely inconsistent with everything known about her character. This left the darker theories, the ones involving foul play. Someone had taken Amy, either from the ship or shortly after she left it, either through force or through deception. This theory explained the lack of evidence on the ship, explained the sightings that suggested she was alive, explained the photographs and the trafficking allegations. It was the theory the Bradley family believed, the theory most investigators thought was most likely, and the theory that was most difficult to prove or resolve. If Amy had been taken from the ship, how had it happened? The most likely scenario involved her being drugged at some point, probably during the disco or shortly after. Someone had befriended her, had slipped something into her drink, had incapacitated her to the point where she could be moved without resistance. Once drugged, she could have been taken to a crew area, hidden until the ship docked, and then removed during the confusion of arrival in Curacao. Alternatively, she could have been convinced to leave with someone voluntarily, perhaps lured with a story about an after-hours party or some other attraction, and then been taken captive once away from the safety of the ship. The man Ron Bradley had seen with Amy on the deck in the early morning hours was almost certainly significant. This sighting, made at approximately 5:15 in the morning, placed Amy in the company of an unidentified male just hours before she was discovered missing. Ron's description of the man was frustratingly vague, because he had only seen him from a distance and in dim light. The man appeared to be young, possibly in his 20s or 30s, casually dressed, and seemed familiar with Amy in a way that suggested they were talking comfortably together rather than in any kind of confrontation. The most obvious suspect in that category was Alistair Douglas, the bass player known as Yellow, who had been seen talking with Amy at the disco. Yellow had denied being the man on the deck with Amy, had claimed he went to his quarters after the disco closed and did not see her again. His bandmates supported this alibi, but they were all part of the same group and would have reason to protect each other. The band members had been questioned, but never charged with anything related to Amy's disappearance. Without physical evidence linking any of them to what happened, Without witnesses who could definitively place them with Amy after she left the disco, there was no basis for arrest or prosecution. Yellow became a focus of the family's private investigation. They researched his background, tracked his movements after the cruise, and found some troubling information. Yellow had a history that included alleged involvement in inappropriate behavior toward female passengers on previous cruises, though nothing had been formally prosecuted. After Amy's disappearance, he continued working on cruise ships for some time, and there were other reports of women feeling uncomfortable around him or his bandmates. Whether this constituted evidence of involvement in Amy's disappearance or simply indicated that he was an unsavory character was unclear. The Bradley family believed Yellow knew more than he had told investigators. They felt that his behavior during questioning had been evasive, that his explanations had not fully accounted for his whereabouts during the critical hours, that there were inconsistencies in his story that had never been adequately explained. They wanted him to be re-questioned, wanted more pressure applied to him and his associates, wanted the investigation to treat him as a prime suspect rather than just a witness. Law enforcement had looked into Yellow multiple times over the years, but without new evidence that directly connected him to Amy's disappearance, there was a limit to what they could do. The investigation into the cruise ship itself revealed concerning information about security practices and crew oversight. Royal Caribbean, like all cruise lines, employed crew members from dozens of countries, many of whom worked on temporary contracts and had limited background screening. The turnover rate among crew was high, making it difficult to track individuals after they left employment. The security footage systems on ships were not comprehensive, with many areas not covered by cameras and footage being routinely recorded over after a certain period. The procedures for handling missing person reports were not as rigorous as they should have been, with crucial time lost in the early hours after Amy's disappearance. In the years following Amy's case, reforms were implemented in the cruise industry partly as a result of the publicity her disappearance generated. Security camera coverage was expanded, retention periods for footage were extended, procedures for reporting and investigating missing persons were improved, and background checks for crew members were enhanced. The Bradleys took some small comfort in knowing that their suffering had led to changes that might protect other families, but these reforms came too late to help Amy. The Rhapsody of the Seas continued operating for years after Amy's disappearance, carrying thousands of passengers on Caribbean cruises, the same route repeated over and over. Most of these passengers probably never knew about Amy Bradley, never knew that someone had vanished from this very ship, that beneath the festive atmosphere and vacation pleasure was a story of loss and mystery. The ship itself was eventually retired from the Royal Caribbean fleet in 2020, sold to another cruise line, its connection to Amy's case fading into the archives of maritime history. In 2013, 15 years after Amy's disappearance, the case was featured on the CNN program, Finding Amy Bradley. The special brought renewed attention to the investigation, presented updated information about the trafficking theory, and included interviews with the Bradley family and with investigators who had worked on the case. The program was watched by millions of people, generated a new wave of tips, and reminded the public that Amy's family had never given up searching for her. One of the most poignant moments in the CNN special was Brad Bradley's emotional appeal directly to Amy. Looking into the camera, his voice breaking, he spoke to his sister as if she could hear him, told her that the family loved her, that they would never stop looking for her, that she should never give up hope because they hadn't. It was a moment of raw humanity, a brother's love transcending time and distance, and all the darkness that separated them. Viewers around the world were moved by his words, by the family's unshakable devotion, by the tragedy of a case that remained unsolved after so many years. The program also explored the broader context of cruise ship disappearances, revealing that Amy's case was not unique. Dozens of people had vanished from cruise ships over the years, some under circumstances that suggested foul play, others that remained completely inexplicable. The cruise industry's response to these cases had been inconsistent, with some investigations being handled professionally and others being mishandled or given insufficient resources. The lack of a unified international framework for investigating such cases meant that outcomes often depended on which country had jurisdiction, which law enforcement agencies became involved, and how much pressure was applied by families and media. Amy's case became emblematic of these larger issues, a symbol of the vulnerability passengers faced when traveling in international waters, of the challenges families encountered when trying to get answers, of the need for better regulations and oversight. Advocacy groups formed around these issues, pushing for legislative changes, demanding accountability from cruise lines, and supporting families who found themselves in situations similar to what the Bradleys had experienced. Ron Bradley became a spokesperson for these advocacy efforts, testifying before Congress on multiple occasions, meeting with legislators to discuss proposed reforms, and working with other families whose loved ones had disappeared from cruise ships. He channeled his anger and frustration into productive activism, trying to create meaning from tragedy, trying to ensure that Amy's disappearance would lead to positive change even if it couldn't lead to her return. This work gave him a sense of purpose beyond the investigation itself, a way to feel that he was doing something constructive with the pain that threatened to consume him. Iva focused her energy on maintaining Amy's presence in the missing persons databases and in the public consciousness. She ensured that Amy's case was featured in every relevant publication, that her information was shared with every organization that worked with trafficking victims, that her story was known to law enforcement agencies throughout the Western Hemisphere. She created relationships with other families of missing persons, forming a community of people who understood what she was going through in ways that those who hadn't experienced such loss simply couldn't. The Bradley family home became a kind of shrine to Amy. Her bedroom remained as it had been when she left for the cruise, preserved exactly, waiting for her return. Photographs of Amy covered the walls of the home office that had been converted into a command center for the investigation. Files, maps, timelines, and evidence were organized with meticulous care. Every lead was documented, every tip was recorded, every piece of information was cataloged and cross-referenced. The family had become amateur investigators, learning the terminology and procedures of law enforcement, understanding the technical aspects of criminal investigation, developing expertise born of necessity and desperation. Brad attempted to maintain some balance between honoring Amy's memory and living his own life. He married and had children, but even these joyful occasions were shadowed by Amy's absence. His wife understood that Amy would always be a presence in their home, that the search for her would never truly end, that a part of Brad's heart would always be frozen in that moment when he last saw his sister in the disco. Brad's children grew up knowing about the aunt they had never met, seeing her photographs, hearing her story, understanding that their family carried a grief that would never fully heal. As the investigation stretched into its second decade, and then toward its third, the reality of aging, a factor the family had to confront. Ron and Iva were getting older, their health was declining, and the possibility that they might not live to see Amy found became increasingly real. This added urgency to their efforts, but also a kind of despair. They had given their lives to finding Amy, had sacrificed everything in pursuit of answers, and the thought that they might die without knowing what happened to their daughter was unbearable. The family made provisions in their will for the investigation to continue after their deaths. Money was set aside specifically for maintaining the reward fund, for continuing to employ private investigators, for ensuring that even if they were gone, the search for Amy would not end. They made Brad promise that he would carry on, that he would never give up, that Amy's case would remain active as long as anyone in the family was alive to pursue it. Brad made this promise, though the weight of it was crushing. The knowledge that he would inherit his parents' mission along with their grief. The technological advances of the 2010s brought new tools to the investigation that hadn't existed when Amy first disappeared. Social media platforms offered ways to spread Amy's story to millions of people instantly. Facebook pages dedicated to finding me accumulated thousands of followers who shared her information, who remained alert for any sign of her, who kept the case alive in public discourse. Twitter allowed for rapid dissemination of appeals for information. YouTube hosted videos about Amy's case, some created by the family, others by independent researchers and true crime enthusiasts who analyzed every detail of the disappearance. These digital platforms were both blessing and curse. They amplified the family's message and kept Amy's face before the public, but they also attracted conspiracy theorists, armchair detectives who developed elaborate theories based on incomplete information, and people who harassed the family with accusations or bizarre claims. The Bradleys had to learn to navigate this new landscape, to use social media effectively while protecting themselves from its darker aspects. Age progression technology improved significantly during this period as well. Forensic artists created updated images showing what Amy might look like at 30, 35, 40 years old. These images were based on photographs of her parents and brother at similar ages, on understanding of how facial features change over time, on statistical models of aging patterns. The resulting images showed a woman who looked like Amy but older, with subtle lines around her eyes, a more mature bone structure, the inevitable marks of time passing. These age-progressed images were distributed widely, shared on missing persons websites, posted in Caribbean communities, sent to law enforcement agencies throughout the region. The question of whether Amy would even recognize herself after so many years was one that haunted the family. If she had been held captive since 1998, if she had been subjected to sustained trauma and potentially drug addiction, if she had been psychologically manipulated and controlled, would she remember who she was? Would she know her real name? Would she retain any connection to her previous identity, or would that woman have been destroyed by everything she had endured? These questions had no answers, but they tormented Iva late at night when sleep wouldn't come, when she lay in the darkness imagining her daughter's suffering. In 2016, 18 years after Amy's disappearance, another credible sighting was reported. A woman traveling in Curacao claimed to have seen someone matching Amy's description at a beach bar, accompanied by two men who appeared to be controlling her movements. The witness said the woman had looked directly at her with an expression of desperation, had seemed about to speak, but had been quickly led away by one of the men before any interaction could occur. The witness reported being struck by how much the woman resembled the age-progressed images of Amy Bradley that had been circulating. This sighting was investigated thoroughly. Security footage from the area was reviewed, though the quality was poor and the crowds made it difficult to identify specific individuals. Local police questioned staff at the beach bar and nearby establishments, but no one remembered seeing the group described by the witness. By the time the investigation was underway, several days had passed since the sighting, and any trail that might have existed had gone cold. The witness was extensively interviewed to assess her credibility. She provided consistent details across multiple interviews, had no apparent motive to fabricate the story, and seemed genuinely disturbed by what she had seen. Investigators concluded that she had likely seen someone, though whether that person was Amy or someone who resembled her could not be definitively determined. The family chose to believe it was Amy, chose to interpret this sighting as evidence that she was still alive, still in the Caribbean region, still trying to signal for help when opportunities presented themselves. This sighting prompted another round of intensive searching in Curacao. Ron, now in his 70s and in declining health, made what would be one of his final trips to the island. He walked the streets with renewed determination, driven by the possibility that Amy was so close, that after all these years they might be on the verge of finding her. He hired local investigators to canvass the area where the sighting had occurred, to show Amy's photographs in every establishment, to make it known that a substantial reward was available for credible information. But once again the search yielded nothing concrete. The Caribbean is a transient place, especially in tourist areas, where people come and go constantly, where establishing patterns and tracking individuals is incredibly difficult. If Amy was being moved regularly between locations, if her captors were careful to keep her hidden and controlled, finding her would require either extraordinary luck or someone on the inside willing to betray the trafficking network. Neither seemed likely to occur. Ron's health deteriorated significantly after this trip. The combination of advanced age, chronic stress, and the physical demands of his investigative work had taken an irreversible toll. He developed serious cardiovascular problems that required multiple hospitalizations. His doctors told him plainly that he needed to reduce his stress levels, that continuing to pursue the investigation with such intensity would likely kill him. Ron's response was that he would rather die searching for Amy than live a longer life having abandoned her. This was not bravado or dramatic posturing, it was simple truth. His life had no meaning without the search, and he preferred whatever time he had left to be spent in pursuit of his daughter. Iva watched her husband's decline with helpless anguish. She was caught between wanting Ron to rest, to preserve his health, to spare himself further suffering, and understanding that asking him to abandon the search was asking him to die in a different way. The investigation was the only thing keeping him going, the only thing that gave structure and purpose to his days. Without it, he would simply fade away, consumed by grief and futility. So she supported his continued efforts even as she feared each trip might be his last, even as she knew the strain was killing him. Brad, now in his 40s, found himself in the strange position of becoming his parents' caretaker, while also maintaining the search for his sister. He managed their medical appointments, their medications, their daily needs, all while also handling the practical aspects of the investigation that had become too much for his aging parents. He reviewed tips, coordinated with law enforcement, maintained the website and social media presence, and served as the family's primary contact with the media. The burden was enormous, and there were times when he felt he would collapse under the weight of it. But giving up was not an option. It had never been an option, and it never would be. Amy was out there somewhere, alive or dead, and the family would continue searching until they found her or until there was no one left to search. This commitment had defined them, had consumed them, had transformed them into people they barely recognized from who they had been before March 24, 1998. They were harder now, more cynical, less trusting. The world that had once seemed basically safe and fair had revealed itself to be dangerous and unjust, and they could never return to the innocence they had lost. The investigation had also revealed uncomfortable truths about the systems meant to protect people. The cruise industry's self-regulation meant that companies prioritized profit and reputation over passenger safety. The fragmented nature of international law enforcement meant that cases like Amy's fell through jurisdictional cracks, where no single agency had full responsibility. The reality of human trafficking meant that thousands of women were trapped in situations similar to what Amy might be experiencing, and law enforcement resources were insufficient to combat the networks that enslaved them. These realizations politicized the Bradley family in ways they never would have imagined. Ron and Iva, who had previously been apolitical, focused on their jobs and their family, became activists and advocates. They lobbied for changes in how cruise ships were regulated, for improved international cooperation on trafficking cases, for more resources dedicated to finding missing persons. They met with senators and congressmen, with FBI directors and State Department officials, with anyone who had the power to change the systems that had failed Amy. Some of their advocacy bore fruit. The Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act, passed in 2010, included provisions that were directly influenced by Amy's case and the Bradley family's testimony. The law required cruise lines to maintain rape kits, to report crimes to the FBI, to improve video surveillance, and to implement other security measures. These were meaningful reforms, but they came more than a decade after Amy's disappearance. Too late to help her, but hopefully in time to prevent similar tragedies for others. The family also worked with organizations dedicated to combating human trafficking. They shared what they had learned about how trafficking networks operated, about the tactics used to control victims, about the challenges of investigating and prosecuting these crimes. Their painful expertise, gained through years of desperate searching, became a resource for others fighting the same battles. They found some comfort in knowing that their suffering was not entirely pointless, that it had generated knowledge that might save others. In 2017, the FBI produced a comprehensive report on Amy's case, summarizing nearly 20 years of investigation, analyzing all the evidence and theories, and assessing the likelihood of various scenarios. The report concluded that Amy had most likely been the victim of human trafficking, that she had probably been abducted from the ship, or shortly after leaving it, and that she had likely been taken to one or more locations in the Caribbean or South America where she was forced into prostitution. The report acknowledged that without a body or a living witness who could testify to what happened, definitive proof impossible, but the preponderance of evidence pointed toward this conclusion. The report also addressed the photographs that had been so controversial. After extensive analysis using the most advanced forensic techniques available, the FBI stated that while they could not confirm with absolute certainty that the woman in the photographs was Amy Bradley, the similarities were significant enough that the images should be considered credible evidence supporting the trafficking theory. This was as close to confirmation as the family was likely to get, and they seized upon it as vindication of what they had believed all along. The report identified several persons of interest in the case, though it did not name them publicly. These individuals, including some crew members from the Rhapsody of the Seas, and some known traffickers operating in the Caribbean region during the relevant time period, were considered to have possible knowledge of or involvement in Amy's disappearance. The FBI indicated that the investigation remained open and that they would continue to pursue any viable leads that emerged. However, the report also acknowledged that after so many years, the likelihood of finding Amy alive had diminished significantly, an assessment that the family refused to accept. Ron Bradley passed away in 2018, 20 years after Amy's disappearance, never having learned what happened to his daughter. His final years had been consumed entirely by the search. Every moment focused on finding Amy, every resource directed toward that singular goal. On his deathbed, he made Brad promise once more to continue the investigation, to never give up, to find Amy no matter how long it took. Brad gave his word, knowing that he was inheriting a mission that would define the rest of his life, just as it had defined his father's. Ron's funeral was attended by hundreds of people, including law enforcement officers who had worked on Amy's case, journalists who had covered it, families of other missing persons who had found solidarity with the Bradleys, and advocates who had worked alongside Ron in his efforts to reform cruise ship regulations and combat human trafficking. The eulogy spoke of Ron's determination, his refusal to surrender to despair, his transformation of personal tragedy into public advocacy. But beneath all the words was the unspoken reality that Ron had without the closure he had sought, that his life had ended with the question that had tortured him for 2 decades still unanswered. Iva, now widowed and in her 70s, faced the prospect of continuing without her partner in the search. Ron had been the more public face of their efforts, the one who traveled to dangerous places, who confronted possible suspects, who pushed investigators to do more. Iva had been the organizational force, the one who maintained the records and coordinated the efforts. But they had been a team, and his loss left a void that could not be filled. She leaned more heavily on Brad, and together they committed to carrying forward Ron's legacy. The investigation entered a new phase after Ron's death. Resources were more limited now, the family's finances having been largely depleted over 2 decades of private investigators, reward money, travel expenses, and advocacy work. Brad had his own family to support and could not devote himself full time to the search as his father had done. The approach became more measured, more dependent on law enforcement and less on private efforts, more reactive to incoming tips than proactive in generating new leads. But the family's commitment never wavered. Amy's website remained active, updated regularly with any new information. Her case remained featured on missing databases throughout the United States and internationally. The reward for information leading to her return, or to her remains, stood at over $250,000, funded by donations from people around the world who had been moved by her story. Every year on Amy's birthday and on the anniversary of her disappearance, the family issued public appeals for information, reminding the world that they were still searching, still waiting, still hoping. The sightings continued sporadically. In 2019, a cruise ship employee reported seeing a woman who matched Amy's description in a small town in Colombia. The woman had been with a man who appeared to be controlling her, had looked malnourished and frightened, had blonde hair that might have been dyed from another color. By the time this sighting was reported and investigated, the woman was gone. In 2020, a similar report came from Venezuela, where a sex trafficking victim who had been rescued claimed to have been held with an American woman who said her name was Amy. This lead was pursued vigorously, but the rescued woman could not provide enough specific information to locate where she had been held, or who the American woman actually was. Each of these sightings was both a gift and a curse. They kept hope alive but also prolonged the agony, offering the possibility of resolution while delivering only continued uncertainty. The family had learned over the years not to get too emotionally invested in any single lead, to maintain a protective skepticism while remaining open to possibilities. It was an exhausting balance, requiring constant modulation of hope and despair, but it was the only way to survive the marathon of searching that their lives had become. The COVID-19 pandemic that began in 2020 complicated the investigation significantly. Travel restrictions made it impossible to pursue leads in person. The Caribbean region was hit hard by the pandemic, with resources diverted to public health crises and away from ongoing criminal investigations. The cruise industry shut down entirely for months, and when it resumed, it was under radically different protocols. The pandemic created a gap in the investigation, a period where active searching became nearly impossible, where the family had to simply wait and hope that opportunities would return when the crisis ended. Iva struggled particularly during this period. Isolated at home, unable to take any active steps toward finding Amy, she felt helpless in ways she hadn't experienced even during the most frustrating periods of the investigation. At least before, there had always been something to do, some action to take, some task to complete that felt productive. The pandemic forced passivity, and passivity was unbearable. She spent her time organizing and reorganizing the case files, going through every document again, looking for something that might have been missed, some connection that hadn't been made. Brad, juggling work from home responsibilities with caring for his children whose schools were closed, found himself thinking about Amy constantly. The pandemic had forced everyone to confront mortality, to think about what was truly important, to consider how fragile life was and how quickly everything could change. These reflections made Amy's absence even more acute. 22 years had passed since she disappeared, longer than she had been alive before that night. Brad was now older than Amy could ever been if she had died the day she vanished, a surreal realization that made him feel as if he had somehow outlived his older sister. When travel restrictions began at E21, the family resumed their efforts with renewed intensity. Iva and Brad traveled to Curaçao together, retracing the steps that had been taken so many times before, meeting with law enforcement officials who had inherited the case from their predecessors, ensuring that Amy's information was still current and accessible. They placed new flyers updated with the latest age, progressed images showing what Amy might look like at 46 years old. The woman in these images had gray streaking through her blonde hair, deeper lines around her eyes and mouth, a middle-aged appearance that was jarring to the family who still pictured Amy as the vibrant 23-year-old who had disappeared. The investigation had now consumed Brad's entire adult life. He had been 24 when Amy vanished. He was now approaching 50. His children were growing up in the shadow of an aunt they had never met, their family gatherings always marked by the absence of someone they knew only through photographs and stories. Brad wondered what he would tell his own children someday about this mission he had inherited, this search that had defined his existence. Would they understand why it had been necessary? Would they resent the time and resources it had consumed? Would they carry it forward if he asked them to, or would Amy's case finally be allowed to rest when his generation was gone? These were questions without easy answers. The obligation to continue searching felt absolute and non-negotiable, inscribed in Brad's very being through decades of devotion and through the promises he had made to his dying father. But he also recognized that at some point, the investigation might have to evolve into something different, might have to become more about remembrance and memorialization than active searching. The thought of reaching that point filled him with guilt, as if considering it was a betrayal of Amy. But he also had to be realistic about what was possible. The nature of the available evidence meant that unless someone came forward with direct testimony about what happened to Amy, unless her remains were found and identified, unless she was somehow recovered alive, the case might never be definitively resolved. This was the agonizing reality of many missing persons cases, that they existed in a state of permanent ambiguity, neither solved nor definitively unsolvable, neither closed nor fully active. Families learned to live in this liminal space, this purgatory of not knowing, carrying their grief like a weight that never got lighter, only more familiar. The trafficking theory remained the most likely explanation for Amy's disappearance, supported by the sightings, the photographs, the testimony of witnesses like David Carmichael, and the FBI's analysis. If this theory was correct, Amy's fate had probably been determined long ago. Her life claimed by the violence and exploitation that characterized the trafficking industry. Women who entered that world rarely emerged from it, especially after so many years. Especially when they had aged beyond the period, when they were considered most profitable to their captors. This grim reality was something the family had to confront, but could never fully accept. While acknowledging intellectually that Amy was probably dead, they could not allow themselves to believe it emotionally. Hope, however irrational, however unsupported by evidence, was all they had. To abandon hope would be to abandon Amy, to declare that her life no longer mattered, that her suffering could be forgotten. So they continued hoping, continued searching, continued maintaining the vigil that had defined their family for more than 2 decades. The question of what justice would look like in Amy's case was complicated. Even if her fate were definitively determined, even if those responsible for her disappearance and whatever happened to her were identified, the likelihood of prosecution was minimal. Many of the potential perpetrators might be dead themselves by now. Those who survived might be in countries that would not extradite them to face trial. The evidence would be old, memories faded, witnesses scattered or unwilling to testify. Building a prosecutable case after so many years would be extraordinarily difficult even under ideal circumstances. And the circumstances of Amy's case were far from ideal. But the family wanted answers more than they wanted convictions. They wanted to know what happened, wanted to understand Amy's final hours, wanted to be able to bury her if she was dead or rescue her if by some miracle she was still alive. They wanted the story to have an ending, even if that ending was tragic. The not knowing was worse than the worst truth could be, or so they told themselves, though they had never actually faced the worst truth, and could not know for certain how they would survive it. The psychological impact of Amy's disappearance extended far beyond the immediate family, rippling outward to touch everyone who had known her or who had become invested in her case. Amy's friends from college, who had graduated and moved on with their lives, found themselves unable to fully escape the shadow of what had happened to her. Reunions were marked by her absence. Conversations eventually circled back to speculation about her fate, and the carefree memories of their college years were forever tainted by the knowledge of how Amy's story had ended. Or rather, had failed to end. Some of Amy's friends became advocates for missing persons causes, channeling their helplessness into action. They organized fundraisers for the Bradley Family's Reward Fund, created awareness campaigns on college campuses about the dangers of human trafficking, and volunteered with organizations that worked to prevent victimization and support families of the missing. This activism gave them a sense of doing something, of honoring Amy's memory in productive ways, of ensuring that her disappearance would not be in vain, even if she could never be brought home. Others found the pain too overwhelming and distanced themselves from any connection to the case. They felt guilty for moving on with their lives while Amy remained missing. Guilty for the happiness they experienced when Amy's family could find none. Guilty for gradually thinking about her less often as the years accumulated. This guilt created its own kind of suffering, a sense that joy was somehow disloyal, that living a full life was a betrayal of friendship. They struggled to find balance between honoring Amy's memory and allowing themselves to exist beyond the tragedy. The crew members of the Rhapsody of the Seas who had been working on the ship when Amy disappeared, carried their own burdens. Some had been questioned extensively, had been viewed with suspicion, had seen their names appear in media coverage and online speculation about the case. Even those who had nothing to do with what happened to Amy found their careers affected, their reputations touched by association with such a notorious disappearance. The cruise ship industry is relatively small, and word traveled about which employees had been on that particular voyage. Some faced discrimination from future employers who worried about liability or negative publicity. Alistair Douglas, the bass player known as Yella, became a particular focus of public suspicion despite never being charged with any crime. Online sleuths dissected his every statement, analyzed his body language in interviews, constructed theories about his involvement based on fragmentary evidence and speculation. His life was disrupted in ways that would have been devastating even if he was completely innocent, and the question of his actual involvement remained unresolved. He maintained his innocence consistently, claimed he had been forthcoming with investigators, and insisted that he had no knowledge of what happened to Amy beyond their brief interaction at the disco. Without a trial, without formal charges, the public could never know the truth about Yellow's involvement or lack thereof. He existed in his own liminal space, not convicted but not exonerated, unable to fully move past an event that had occurred decades ago, but that continued to define how many people saw him. Whether he deserved this ongoing scrutiny, or was himself a victim of circumstance, was something only he could know, and he had long since stopped trying to convince skeptics of his innocence. The FBI agents and law enforcement officers who worked on Amy's case over the years carried the weight of an unsolved investigation. Those who had been involved in the early stages sometimes lay awake at night, thinking about what they might have done differently, about whether different decisions in those first critical hours could have changed the outcome. They knew intellectually that they had followed proper procedures, had done everything they could with the information and resources available. But that knowledge didn't erase the feeling of failure that came with leaving a case unresolved. Special Agent Kelly McGovern, who had taken over as the FBI's lead investigator on Amy's case in the mid-2000s, developed a particularly close relationship with the Bradley family. She understood their pain in ways that transcended professional sympathy, had invested herself emotionally in finding answers, even while maintaining the objectivity necessary for effective investigation. She reviewed the case file regularly, looking for angles that might have been missed, for new technologies or investigative techniques that could be applied to old evidence. She contacted the family on significant dates, Amy's birthday and the anniversary of her disappearance, to let them know she hadn't forgotten, that the case remained active, that hope persisted however slim it might be. Agent McGovern had seen other long-term missing persons cases resolved through unexpected breakthroughs, decades after the disappearance. She knew that persistence could sometimes yield results when logic suggested none were possible. She had seen bodies discovered by hikers in remote areas, seen deathbed confessions that finally revealed what had happened to victims long presumed lost, seen advances in DNA technology solve cold cases that had seemed permanently frozen. These precedents kept her engaged with Amy's case, convinced her that continued effort was worthwhile, even when progress seemed impossible. But Agent McGovern also had to manage the family's expectations, had to help them understand the realities of what was and wasn't possible after so much time had passed. She had difficult conversations with Iva and Brad about the decreasing likelihood of finding Amy alive, about the need to consider what closure might look like if it came in the form of recovering remains rather than rescuing a living person. These conversations were painful but necessary, attempts to prepare the family for outcomes they refused to accept, but might eventually have to face. The private investigators the Bradley family had employed over the years had their own perspectives on the case. Some had worked on it for months or years, becoming deeply familiar with its details, developing their own theories about what happened. Others had been consulted briefly, providing specific expertise or pursuing particular leads before moving on to other cases. Nearly all of them agreed that Amy had most likely been trafficked, though they differed on the specifics of when and how it happened, and where she might have been taken. One investigator, a former DEA agent named Frank Jones who specialized in Caribbean trafficking networks, spent 3 years working almost exclusively on Amy's case. He developed extensive contacts in the underworld of several Caribbean nations, paid informants for information, and came tantalizingly close to what he believed was solid evidence of Amy's fate. According to Jones, he received credible information from multiple sources suggesting that Amy had been taken off the ship by a trafficking ring with connections to organized crime in Colombia, that she had been held initially in Curos, all but moved within days to the South American mainland, and that she had been forced to work in brothels in multiple cities before dying sometime around 2003 from a combination of drug overdose and physical trauma. Jones claimed that he had identified the specific individuals responsible for Amy's abduction and trafficking, including a corrupt crew member from the Rhapsody of the Seas who had facilitated her removal from the ship, the traffickers who had taken custody of her in Curo, and some of the people who had held and exploited her in Colombia. He provided this information to the FBI and to the Bradley family, insisting that he was confident in his sources and his conclusions. However, none of his informants were willing to testify formally or go on record with their claims, and physical evidence to support the allegations could not be found. The individuals Jones identified as responsible either denied involvement, had alibis that could not be definitively disproven, or were already dead and thus could not be questioned. The Bradley family wanted desperately to believe Jones's account because it provided answers, created a narrative that explained what happened to Amy, and identified those responsible even if justice could not be achieved. But they also struggled with the lack of definitive proof, with the possibility that Jones's informants had been telling him what he wanted to hear in exchange for payment, with the troubling gaps and inconsistencies in the story as it had been reconstructed. Without Amy's body, without any physical evidence directly linking the named individuals to her disappearance, the account remained one theory among several, plausible but unproven. Agent McGovern reviewed Jones's findings thoroughly and concluded that while some elements were credible and consistent with other evidence, other aspects were based on hearsay from sources whose reliability could not be verified. She thanked Jones for his work, but cautioned the family against treating his conclusions as definitive. This created tension between the FBI and the Bradley family, with Iva and Brad frustrated by what they saw as excessive caution and bureaucratic reluctance to pursue leads that seemed promising. Agent McGovern understood their frustration, but also knew that following false leads could waste resources and create false hope, that her responsibility was to pursue truth rather than comfortable narratives. The question of Amy's remains became increasingly central as the years passed. If she had died, where was her body? Human trafficking victims who die in captivity are sometimes buried in unmarked graves, sometimes disposed of in ways meant to prevent identification, sometimes simply abandoned in remote locations where they may never be found. The geographic scope of where Amy's remains could be was enormous anywhere in the Caribbean, anywhere in South America, anywhere the trafficking networks operated. Searching such a vast area was impossible without more specific information about where to look. Advances in DA technology offered some hope. The FBI had Amy's DNA profile on file derived from personal items and from her parents' DNA. This profile was entered into databases that could be checked against unidentified remains found anywhere in the United States, or in countries that shared such information with American law enforcement. If Amy's body was discovered and processed by authorities who submitted DNA samples for testing, there was a possibility of identification even decades after death. But this required the remains to be found, to be recognized as potentially significant, and to be tested, none of which was guaranteed. The Bradley family had considered consulting psychics and mediums on multiple occasions, desperate enough to try anything that might provide information. Some psychics had contacted them unsolicited, claiming to have visions or impressions about Amy's fate. The information provided ranged from the vague and generic to the specific and bizarre, none of it ultimately useful or verifiable. Agent McGovern gently discouraged the family from putting too much stock in psychic claims, explaining that in her experience, such information was rarely if ever accurate, and could lead investigations in wrong directions. But the family's desperation sometimes overrode rational skepticism. Iva consulted with several mediums over the years, hoping for some connection to Amy, some sign that her daughter's spirit was at peace, or that she could provide information about what happened. The mediums told Iva what she wanted to hear, describing Amy as being in a better place, as watching over her family, as wanting them to know she loved them. These sessions provided temporary comfort but no actual information, and afterward Iva always felt foolish for having sought them out, angry at herself for being vulnerable enough to fall for what she knew intellectually was likely manipulation. Brad was more cynical about psychics, viewing them as predators who exploited grieving families for profit or attention. He had researched cold reading techniques, had learned how psychics used general statements that could apply to almost anyone, how they read body language and verbal cues to tailor their messages to what clients wanted to hear. He tried to protect his mother from these charlatans, but also understood her need for any connection, however false, to Amy. He couldn't bring himself to deny her that comfort even when he knew it was based on deception. The case had generated its own mythology over the years. Stories and theories that circulated online and in true crime communities, some based on evidence and some purely speculative. One persistent theory suggested that Amy had been specifically targeted before the cruise even began, that someone had identified her as a potential trafficking victim, and had arranged to be on the same cruise to facilitate her abduction. This theory was based partly on the band members' interaction with Amy, on the suggestion that it had been too convenient, too planned. Another theory proposed that Amy had witnessed something she shouldn't have, perhaps involving drug trafficking or other criminal activity on the ship, and had been eliminated to keep her silent. This theory struggled to explain the sightings of Amy after her disappearance, or the photographs that seemed to show her in trafficking situations. But proponents argued that the sightings were mistaken identity, and the photographs were faked to misdirect the investigation. This theory appealed to those who favored conspiracy thinking, who wanted the case to be more complex and calculated than an opportunistic abduction. A smaller group of theorists believed Amy had arranged her own disappearance, that she had wanted to escape her life for reasons unknown to her family, and had used the cruise as an opportunity to vanish. This theory required believing that Amy had maintained her disappearance for more than 2 decades, that she had allowed her family to suffer without contact, that she had essentially died to her former identity and created a new life elsewhere. Most people familiar with the case rejected this theory as inconsistent with everything known about Amy's character and her relationships, but it persisted in certain corners of the internet. The true crime community's obsession with Amy's case was a double-edged sword for the Bradley family. On one hand, it kept the case in public awareness, generated discussion that sometimes led to new tips or perspectives, and created a community of people who cared about finding Amy even if they had never known her personally. On the other hand, it sometimes felt invasive and disrespectful, reducing Amy's life and disappearance to entertainment, treating her tragedy as a puzzle to be solved rather than as the destruction of a real person and the ongoing torment of a real family. Brad occasionally engaged with online communities discussing Amy's case, correcting misinformation when he saw it, thanking people for their interest and support, and sometimes sharing information that hadn't been widely publicized. These interactions were emotionally taxing, requiring him to relive the trauma repeatedly, to see his sister's face and story dissected by strangers, to read theories that ranged from thoughtful to absurd. But he felt obligated to participate, to ensure that Amy's humanity remained central to discussions about her case, to prevent her from becoming just another faceless victim in the endless stream of true crime content. The podcasters, bloggers, and YouTubers who covered Amy's case approached it with varying degrees of sensitivity and accuracy. Some did extensive research, interviewed the family, consulted with law enforcement, and presented the case responsibly and respectfully. Others were more interested in sensationalism, in generating clicks and views, in presenting the most dramatic possible narrative regardless of whether it was supported by evidence. Brad learned to distinguish between those who genuinely wanted to help and those who were exploiting Amy's story, and he cooperated only with the former. One podcast episode about Amy's case, produced by a respected investigative journalist, generated a significant new lead in 2022. A listener who had been a cruise ship employee during the late 1990s contacted the podcast after hearing the episode, saying that she remembered unusual activity on a cruise she had worked around the time of Amy's disappearance. This employee, who had worked for a different cruise line but had interacted with crew from Royal Caribbean ships, said she recalled hearing rumors among crew members about women being taken off ships and sold to trafficking networks, about certain crew members being involved in these operations, about corruption that went high enough in the industry that reporting it seemed futile. The podcast passed this information to the FBI. And Agent McGovern interviewed the former cruise employee extensively. The woman provided names of specific crew members she remembered being associated with these rumors, including some who had worked on Royal Caribbean vessels during the relevant time period. The FBI investigated these individuals, several of whom had since left the cruise industry and were living in various countries. Some were questioned but denied any involvement in trafficking or any knowledge of Amy's case. Others could not be located or were deceased. The lead yielded some interesting context about the cruise ship environment, but no definitive evidence connecting anyone specifically to Amy's disappearance. Still, the fact that a new lead had emerged more than 20 years after the fact, prompted by a podcast episode, reminded everyone involved that the case could potentially still be solved. That somewhere someone knew something, that the right information might surface at any moment. This possibility, however remote, was what kept the investigation alive, what justified continued effort and attention, what sustained the Bradley family's refusal to give up. In 2023, 20 years after Amy's disappearance, the family organized a memorial event in her honor. It was not a funeral, because Amy had never been declared dead in their hearts, but rather a celebration of her life and a renewed call for information about her fate. The event was held in Petersburg, Virginia, Amy's hometown, and was attended by hundreds of people, family members, childhood friends, college classmates, law enforcement officers who had worked on the case, journalists who had covered it, and members of the public who had been touched by Amy's story. Photographs of Amy covered the walls of the venue, showing her at different stages of her life: as a child with a gap-toothed smile, as a teenager playing sports, as a college student laughing with friends, as a young woman on the cusp of adulthood that had been stolen from her. These images reminded everyone of Amy's vitality, of the person she had been beyond the statistics and case files, of the life that should have continued but had instead been interrupted or ended at 23. Brad spoke at the memorial, his voice steady but his eyes betraying the decades of grief he carried. He talked about Amy as a sister, not as a victim, shared memories of their childhood and their relationship, described her dreams and aspirations. He talked about the investigation, about the family's unwavering commitment to finding her, about the hope that never died no matter how much time passed. He appealed once more to anyone with information to come forward, reminding them that it was never too late to do the right thing, that even after 25 years the family still needed answers. Iva, now in her 80s and frail, attended the memorial but did not speak. The emotion was too overwhelming, the years too heavy, the loss too profound to articulate. She sat in the front row, clutching a photograph of Amy, tears streaming down her face, surrounded by people who loved her but could not ease her pain. She had lived more than a quarter century with this agony, had survived when sometimes she thought she couldn't, had maintained her vigil while everything else in her life fell away. She was a warrior, though she had never wanted to be, had never asked for the battle that had consumed her existence. The memorial raised awareness about Amy's case once again, generated media coverage in national outlets, and prompted another wave of tips to the FBI. Most of these tips were well-intentioned but not useful, people reporting vague sightings or offering theories based on publicly available information. But the Bradley family reviewed each one, hoping that among the noise might be the signal they had been waiting for, the piece of information that would finally unlock the mystery of what happened to Amy Lynn Bradley. The question of when to stop searching, of when enough, was one the Bradley family could not bring themselves to answer. They knew that at some point, probably sooner than they wanted to acknowledge, Iva would pass away as Ron had, and Brad would be left as the sole member of the immediate family still actively searching for Amy. They knew that Brad's own children would grow up and might or might not choose to continue the search, that eventually the living memories of Amy would fade into history, that her case would join the thousands of other, unsolved disappearances that haunted families, but were largely forgotten by the world. But that eventual endpoint, however inevitable, was not now and would not be accepted before it was absolutely necessary. As long as anyone who loved Amy still drew breath, the search would continue. As long as there was any possibility, however remote, that she could be found, the effort would persist. This was not a choice but an obligation, not a decision but a destiny that had been forced upon them by events beyond their control. The possibility that Amy had died years or even decades ago, that all the searching and suffering had been for someone who was beyond help, was acknowledged intellectually but rejected emotionally. Even if Amy was dead, finding her remains would provide closure that the family desperately needed. They could finally bury her, could visit a grave, could have a place to mourn that was concrete rather than abstract. They could know what happened, could understand the end of her story, could perhaps find some measure of peace in knowledge, even if that knowledge confirmed their worst fears. But in the absence of such confirmation, hope persisted. Hope that Amy was still alive somewhere, that she was waiting to be found, that she remembered who she was and wanted to come home. Hope that the next tip would be the one that mattered, that the next sighting would be genuine, that the next piece of evidence would be the key that unlocked everything. Hope that after more than 25 years of darkness, light would finally break through. This hope was both gift and curse. It kept the family going, gave them purpose and direction, prevented them from collapsing into complete despair. But it also prevented them from grieving fully, from accepting loss and beginning to heal, from reclaiming the portions of their lives that had been frozen in time since March 24, 1998. They existed in a perpetual present where Amy was always missing, always 23 years old, always just about to be found. Time moved forward for everyone else but not for them, not in the ways that mattered most. The years continued to pass, each one adding weight to the question that could never be answered with certainty. By 2024, 26 years had elapsed since that morning when Amy vanished from the rhapsody of the seas. 26 years of searching and hoping and suffering and refusing to surrender. The investigation remained technically active, though the resources dedicated to it had diminished considerably from the intensive efforts of the early years. Tips still came in occasionally, most of them leading nowhere. But each one was dutifully investigated, each one carrying the faint possibility of being the breakthrough that eluded everyone for so long. Iva Bradley, now approaching 90, spent her days much as she had for decades, maintaining Amy's room, organizing case files, and waiting for news that never came. Her health had declined significantly, her body failing under the accumulated stress of a quarter-century of grief. But her mind remained sharp and her determination undiminished. She knew, though she would not speak it aloud, that she would likely die without ever knowing what happened to her daughter. This knowledge was unbearable, but she bore it anyway because there was no alternative, because mothers do not abandon their children no matter how impossible the situation becomes. Brad, now in his 50s, had become the primary keeper of Amy's memory and the primary driver of the continued search. His own children were approaching adulthood, and he sometimes wondered what he would tell them about inheritance and obligation, about how much of themselves they owed to finding an aunt who had been gone longer than they had been alive. He had spent more of his life searching for Amy than he had spent knowing her, had defined himself by her absence more than by any other single factor. Who would he be if the search ended? What would fill the void that Amy's case had occupied in his heart and mind for so many years? The world had changed dramatically since 1998. Technology had advanced beyond anything imaginable in that earlier era. Social media had transformed how information spread and how investigations were conducted. DNA analysis had become more sophisticated. Surveillance was ubiquitous in ways it had never been before. Yet despite all these advances, despite all the tools that hadn't existed when Amy first disappeared, she remained lost. The fundamental mystery persisted unchanged and seemingly unchangeable, a puzzle that resisted every attempt at solution. The Bradley family understood now what they had not understood in those early desperate days, that some questions have no answers. That some people who disappear are never found. That justice and closure are luxuries not guaranteed to anyone no matter how much they deserve them. They understood that their search might continue until every member of the family was gone. Until Amy's case was finally allowed to rest, not because it was solved, but because there was no one left who remembered her clearly enough to keep searching. But understanding this reality and accepting it were different things entirely. So they continued day after day, year after year, maintaining their vigil in the darkness, waiting for light that might never come. They continued because Amy deserved to be searched for, because love does not calculate odds or surrender to logic, because the alternative was unthinkable. They continued because somewhere, in some way they could not fully articulate, Amy was still their daughter, still their sister, still worth every moment of suffering and every ounce of effort. And they would continue searching until there was no one left to search, until the ocean finally gave up its secrets or time rendered the question meaningless. They would continue because that was what family meant, what love required, what Amy deserved. They would search for her in the shadows and in the light, in this world and in whatever lay beyond. Refusing to let her disappear completely, refusing to let her be forgotten, refusing to surrender to the darkness that had claimed her night aboard the Rhapsody of the Seas. The case of Amy Lynn Bradley remains unsolved, a mystery that has haunted everyone who encountered it, a tragedy that transformed lives and revealed uncomfortable truths about the world we inhabit. Her family's search continues even now, decades after she vanished, driven by love that time cannot diminish and hope that evidence cannot quite extinguish. Whether Amy will ever be found, whether her fate will ever be known with certainty, whether her family will ever find the closure they so desperately need, remains to be seen. But one thing is certain: Amy Lynn Bradley has not been forgotten. Her story lives on in the hearts of those who loved her, in the efforts of those who continue searching for her, in the advocacy that emerged from her family's suffering, and in the awareness her case raised about the dangers that lurk beneath Paradise's surface. She lives on as a symbol of all the missing, all the lost, all those who vanished and left behind only questions and grief. She lives on because her family refuses to let her die, refuses to stop believing that somewhere, somehow, Amy might still come home. Thank you for listening to this case. If you have any information about Amy Lynn Bradley's disappearance, please contact the FBI or the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. If you enjoyed this case, please leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. Good night and stay safe.